Hey guys. Okay. Today's read aloud, we're going to continue with the witches, but I want to add a layer onto what we're doing. We're still going to be answering some questions related to the reading, because we're still getting in the spirit of doing proper reading and writing responses, especially the teacher asks questions about the reading. But we're also going to touch on a subject that you may have talked about last year in third grade. I'm assuming most of you did, unless you weren't here at that time in school. But it's the concept of the reading voice and the thinking voice. And as you can see behind me, I've got a little character with his reading voice and his thinking voice going on. And I want you to pause for a few seconds, and I want you to think about what a reading voice is. What was the reading voice? Remember, the reading voice is how you read the book. It's the purpose of the reading voice is the voice that reads the words on the page. The purpose of the reading voice. I want to state that again for you. The purpose of the reading voice. It's the voice that reads the words and looks at the pictures on the page. But there's so much more to reading than just going, and then the boy said to his grandmama, "Oh boy, grandmama, tell me more about witches." You have to bring in the thinking voice. The thinking voice is when you stop and you make connections. You stop and you think about what you're reading. Reading voice, thinking voice. You go from your reading voice and your thinking voice. They talk to one another. You read, you think. Ba 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 ba. Oh yeah, that's right. I've seen that before. The thinking voice. It's like a whisper in your head. You have to tune everything else out and listen to that whisper. So I'm going to read the next chapter of The Witches, but I want you to use your reading voice and your thinking voice with me, because I'm going to switch between the two to show you guys how my thinking voice and reading voice will work as I read. Okay, so we're going to start reading this next chapter of The Witches. Now remember, the boy was just in the auditorium and he had a horrible revelation. He was in an auditorium full of witches. Remember, they were scratching the nape of their neck and then sticking their hands up under their wigs, and he saw everybody was wearing gloves. It's getting pretty intense now. Okay? Now remember, as I read, I'm going to go hold my reading voice. Then when I stop to have a thought, you might have to turn your iPad up, because I'm going to whisper and go, thinking voice. Okay. Next chapter. I think it's chapter 6. They're not numbered. I'm just going to number them as I go. Frizzled like a fritter. Frizzled like a fritter. I know a fritter. I like apple fritters. So that's got to be frizzled like some food. All the women, or rather the witches, were now sitting motionless in their chairs and staring as though hypnotized at somebody who had suddenly appeared on the platform. That somebody was another woman. Use my thinking voice. So they are mesmerized by, or hypnotized by, another woman or witch that has appeared on stage. Who could it be that has such power over witches that they're all hypnotized? That's my thinking voice. Like, oh gosh, who could it be? I think I know who it is. I'm going to read on to see. The first thing I noticed about this woman was her size. She was tiny, probably no more than 4.5 feet tall. She looked quite young, I guessed about 25 or 6, and she was very pretty. She had on a rather stylish long black dress that reached right to the ground, and she wore black gloves that came up to her elbows. Unlike the others, she wasn't wearing a hat. She didn't look to me like a witch at all. But she couldn't possibly not be one. Otherwise, what on earth was she doing up there on the platform? And why, for heaven's sake, were all the other witches gazing at her with such a mixture of adoration, awe, and fear? Very slowly, the young lady on the platform raised her hands to her face. I saw her gloved fingers unhooking something behind her ears, and then she caught hold of her cheeks and lifted her face clean away. The whole of that pretty face came away in her hands. It was a mask. Is this the Grand High Witch? It's gotta be. Who else could it be to command all these witches? As she took off the mask, she turned sideways and placed it carefully upon a small table nearby. And when she turned round again and faced us, I very nearly screamed out loud. That face of hers was the most frightful and frightening thing I have ever seen. Just looking at it gave me shakes all over. It was so crumpled and wizened, so shrunken and shriveled, it looked as though it had been pickled in vinegar. It was a fearsome and ghastly sight. There was something terribly wrong about it, something foul and putrid and decayed. I'm just thinking about zombie heads and all the zombie movies I've seen, or the scary stories I've read where they describe something similar, and I'm making a connection that her face must look very frightening, like something that has come out of the ground, or something out of my worst nightmares. It seemed quite literally to be rotting away at the edges, and in the middle of the face, around the mouth and the cheeks, I could see the skin all cankered and worm-eaten, as though maggots were working away in there. There are times when something is so frightful, you become mesmerized by it and can't look away. I was like that now. I was transfixed. I was numbed. I was magnetized by the sheer horror of this woman's features. But there was more to it than that. There was a look of serpents in those eyes of hers, and they flashed around the audience. I knew immediately, of course, that this was none other than the Grand High Witch herself. I knew also why she had worn a mask. She could never have moved around in public, let alone book in at a hotel with her real face. Everyone who saw her would have run away screaming. I was right, that is the Grand High Witch. She sounds like she's the most fearsome of all the witches, which is why she would have that title. "The doors!" shouted the Grand High Witch in a voice that filled the room and bolted around the walls. "Are they chained and bolted?" "The doors are chained and bolted, your grandness," answered a voice in the audience. The brilliant snake's eyes that were set so deep in the dreadful, rotting, worm-eaten face glared unblinkingly at the witches who sat facing her. "You may remove your gloves," she shouted. Let's stop and use my thinking voice here, because what did Grandma say their fingers look like? They have hooks instead of normal fingers, so they're taking off their gloves and revealing their fingers. Her voice, I noticed, had that same hard metallic quality as the voice of the witch I had met under the conker tree, only it was far louder and much harsher. It rasped, it grated, it snarled, it scraped, it shrieked, and it growled. Everyone in the room was peeling off her gloves. I was watching the hands of those in the back row. I wanted very much to see what their fingers looked like and whether my grandmother had been right. Ah, yes! I could see several of them now. I could see the brown claws curving over the tips of the fingers. They were about 2 inches long, those claws, and sharp at the ends. "You may remove your shoes," barked the Grand High Witch. What did Grandma say their feet look like? They take off their shoes. What's the boy going to look for? They don't have toes. They just have feet, square or rectangle feet with no toes. So that's what I'm thinking. I'm making a connection back to earlier in the text to see what I'm expecting coming up. I heard a sigh of relief going up from all the witches in the room as they kicked off their narrow, high-heeled shoes, and then I got a glimpse under the chairs of several pairs of stocking feet, square and completely toeless. Revolting they were, as though the toes had been sliced away from the feet with a carving knife. "You may remove your wigs," snarled the Grand High Witch. She had a peculiar way of speaking. I'm making a connection to what I know about European languages. And you guys may have seen this in TV shows and stuff too. Some languages, when they try and speak English, they replace their W's with V, which is what the Grand High Witch is doing here. So instead of wigs, she's saying vigs. I'm making a connection to what I've learned over all my years about this languages. I'm thinking. My thinking voice, my reading voice keep talking to each other. There was some sort of a foreign accent there, something harsh and guttural, and she seemed to have trouble pronouncing the letter W. As well as that, she did something funny with the letter R. She would roll it round and round her mouth like a piece of hot pork, crackling before spitting it out. Remove your wigs and get some fresh air on your spotty scalps, she shouted. And another sigh of relief arose from the audience as all the hands went up to the heads, and all the wigs, with the hats still on them, were lifted away. There now appeared to me, in front of me, row upon row of bald female heads, a sea of naked scalps, every one of them red and itchy looking from being rubbed by the linings of the wigs. I simply cannot tell you how awful they were. And somehow the whole sight was made more grotesque because underneath those frightful scabby bald heads, the bodies were dressed in fashionable and rather pretty clothes. It was monstrous. It was unnatural. Oh heavens, I thought, oh help, oh Lord have mercy on me. These foul bald-headed females are child killers, every one of them. And here I am imprisoned in the same room and I can't escape. We need to think back. What did Grandma say about witches? Is he going to be able to escape? At that point, a new and doubly horrifying thought struck me. My grandmother had said that with their special nose holes, they could smell out a child on a pitch-black night from right across the other side of the road. Up to now, my grandmother had been right every time. How had grandmother been right every time? The claws and the fingers, the missing toes, the bald head. It seemed a certainty, therefore, that one of the witches in the back row was going to sniff me out, and at any moment then the yell of "Dogs droppings" would go up all over the room, and I would be cornered like a rat. I knelt on the carpet behind the screen, hardly daring to breathe. Then suddenly I remembered another very important thing my grandmother had told me. The dirtier you are, she had said, the harder it is for a witch to smell you out. How long since I had last had a bath? Not for ages. I had my own room in the hotel. My grandmother never bothered with silly things like that. Come to think of it, I don't believe I'd had a bath since we arrived. When had I last washed my hands or face? That's much different than this day and age, right? We wash our hands all the time, especially during this whole pandemic that's going on. Certainly not this morning. Not yesterday either. I glanced down at my hands. They were covered with smudge and mud and goodness knows what else besides. So perhaps I had a chance after all. The stink waves couldn't possibly get out through all that dirt. "Witches of England!" shouted the Grand High Witch. She herself, I had noticed, had not taken off either her wig or her gloves or her shoes. "Witches of England!" she yelled. The audience stirred uneasily and sat up straighter in their chairs. "Miserable witches!" she yelled. "Useless, lazy witches! Feeble, fribbling witches! You are a heap of idle, good-for-nothing worms!" A shudder went through the audience. The Grand High Witch was clearly in an ugly mood, and they knew it. I had a feeling that something awful was going to happen soon. "I'm having my breakfast this morning," cried the Grand High Witch, "and I am looking out of the window at the beach, and what am I seeing? I am asking you, what am I seeing? I am seeing a revolting sight. I am seeing hundreds, I am seeing thousands of rotten, repulsive little children playing on the sand. It is putting me right off my food. Why have you not got rid of them?" she screamed. "Why have you not rubbed them all out, these filthy, smelly children?" With each word she spoke, flecks of pale blue phlegm shot from her mouth like little bullets. Pale blue phlegm. Remember, Grandmama said they also had blue spit. "I am asking you why!" she screamed. Nobody answered her question. "Children smell," she screamed. "They stink out the world. We do not want these children around here." The bald heads in the audience all nodded vigorously. "One child a week is no good to me," the Grand High Witch cried out. "Is that the best you can do?" "We will do better," murmured the audience. "We will do much better." "Better is no good either," shrieked the Grand High Witch. "I demand maximum results. So here are my orders. My orders are that every single child in this country shall be rubbed out, squashed, squittered, and frittered before I come here again in 1 year's time. Do I make myself clear?" A great gasp went up from the audience. I saw the witches all looking at one another with deeply troubled expressions. Let me use my thinking voice to imagine that. Remember, think, all these witches in the audience, and they all look at each other like, is she serious? Oh my gosh. And I heard one witch at the end of the front row saying aloud, all of them? We can't possibly wipe out all of them. The Grand High Witch whipped round as though someone had stuck a skewer in her bottom. Who said that? She snapped. Who dares to argue with me? It was you, was it not? She pointed a gloved finger as sharp as a needle at the witch who had spoken. I didn't mean it, your grandness, the witch cried out. I didn't mean to argue. I was just talking to myself. You dared to argue with me? Screamed the Grand High Witch. I was just talking to myself, cried the wretched witch. I swear it, your grandness. She began to shake with fear. I wasn't arguing with you. The Grand High Witch took a quick step forward, and then she spoke again. It was in a voice that made my blood run cold. Let's switch to thinking voice. Blood run cold, what does that mean? I've heard that phrase before. What does it mean, blood run cold? The Grand High Witch, oh, I read that, took a step forward and voice that made her blood run cold. A stupid witch who answers back must burn until her bones are black, she screamed. No, no, begged the witch in the front row. The Grand High Witch went on. A foolish witch without a brain must sizzle in the fiery flame. Save me, cried the wretched witch in the front row. The Grand High Witch took no notice of her. She spoke again. An idiotic witch like you must roast upon the barbecue. Forgive me, oh your grandness, cried the miserable culprit. I didn't mean it. But the Grand High Witch continued with her terrible recital. A witch who dares to say I'm wrong will not be with us very long. A moment later, a stream of sparks that looked like tiny white-hot metal filings came shooting out of the Grand High Witch's eye and flew straight towards the one who dared to speak. I saw the sparks striking against her and burrowing into her, and she screamed a horrible howling scream, and a puff of smoke rose up around her. A smell of burning meat filled the room. Nobody moved. Like me, they were all watching the smoke, and when it had cleared away, the chair was empty. I caught a glimpse of something wispy white, like a little cloud, fluttering upwards and disappearing out of the window. A great sigh rose up from the audience. The Grand High Witch glared around the room. I hope nobody else is going to make me cross today. There was a deathly silence. Frizzled like a fritter, said the Grand High Witch. Cooked like a carrot. You will never see her again. Now we can get down to business. That Grand High Witch is scary. She just evaporated a witch. That was the end of that chapter. I wonder what's going to happen next. That poor boy, he's stuck in there with the Grand High Witch. Tune in tomorrow.